At the beginning of the 1960s civil rights movement, a black record company emerged from Detroit, Michigan with soul, sophistication, and style. Motown Records, founded by Berry Gordy Jr., was the source of dozens of top artists, such as Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, and The Supremes. While Motown largely stepped away from the political happenings during its time, the company was able to alleviate racial conflict in the long term through focusing primarily on integration in the music industry and black economic success. From its founding in 1959 to its relocation out of Detroit in 1972, the songwriters, artists, and producers of Motown compromised between black and white cultures, creating an impact on the way African Americans were perceived in America for decades to come. Motown, cultural compromise in a time of political conflict. In order to understand Motown's impact, America's political, economic, and social climate in the mid-1900s must be examined. At the end of the Second World War, America was experiencing a series of both positive and negative economic impacts. As a whole, the nation's gross national product had jumped from $200 billion in 1940 to $300 billion in 1950. But although statistically many Americans were prospering in post-war society, 30% of workers were still suffering from poverty, making less than $3,000 a year. Detroit, Michigan. America's automobile capital and one of the fastest growing boomtowns in the nation. Despite the city's success in the industry, income inequality was at its height. Thousands of African Americans had migrated north to escape lynchings and seek opportunities, but they faced discrimination in the job and housing markets. Jim Crow laws were prominent in the American justice system. Discriminatory attitudes and actions were constructed and justified in part by the images of African Americans to which white city dwellers were exposed. In the job market, company hiring and upgrading policies established and reinforced prejudicial patterns in the workplace. Until 1955, when Michigan passed a Fair Employment Practices Law, employers often specified racial preferences in job listings. When it came to housing, whites vehemently resisted blacks in their neighborhoods. After the construction of the Sojourner Truth Homes project in 1942, white mobs attempted to keep the black residents from moving into their new homes. Conflict and tension charged Detroit's communities as more and more African Americans moved in. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was quickly growing. African Americans banded together to fight against the injustices that were happening in Detroit and in cities across America. In 1954, the Supreme Court declared segregation in schools unconstitutional. A year later, Rosa Parks famously sat in a whites-only seat on a public bus, and 2 years after that, Dr. Martin Luther King assisted in founding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The 1960s was an era of black empowerment, but Motown founder Berry Gordy Jr. approached this in a different way. Born in Detroit on November 28, 1929, Gordy Jr. was the seventh out of 8 children. When he was 14, the 1943 Detroit race riots broke out, a year after the Sojourner Truth Homes riots. However, the Gordy family did not tolerate political discussions at the dinner table, and instead emphasized concerns such as commerce, education, and discipline, stressing the importance of black economic success. After juggling between his passions for boxing and music, Gordy Jr. finally chose to pursue his dreams of songwriting at the age of 21. 9 years later, with an $800 loan from his family and royalties earned writing for Jackie Wilson, he founded the record company Motown. Once again, Gordy Jr. believed that the pathway to black progress was not necessarily to engage in marches or boycotts, but to reach economic success, representing the ability to run a business independently. In order to do so, the people within Motown made several cultural compromises, the first of which was made by the songwriters. Berry Gordy Jr. knew that the songs he produced had to appeal to white audiences. Black music was associated generally with rough blues or jazz, and was rarely played on white radio stations. The key to songwriting, as Motown songwriters Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Eddie Holland found, was to combine both popular music and soul music together. Doo-wop vocal groups of the 1960s enjoyed significant airplay and sales, especially from 1960 through 1964. Therefore, groups that incorporated this more modern, white vocal group style became some of the most successful R&B acts of the 1960s and beyond.
And then she said, just because you
Berry Gordy Jr. eloquently balanced black and white musical styles in order to create a cultural compromise that would lead to the inevitable success of the record company.
keep your freedom for as long as you can now. My mama told me, you better shop around.
The second compromise made was by the artists. Another important component of Motown's success was the physical image of the company. In order to fight against racial stereotypes, Motown artists had to consistently remain clean and sharp. To achieve this, in 1964, Motown hired Maxine Powell, an accomplished black actress and model who owned a modeling and finishing school. Artists were required to attend 2-hour classes every day, where they would learn how to think, act, walk, and talk like royalty.
I said, when I opened up the finishing school in Motown, everybody was sitting in a circle like this because I believe everybody is a star and everybody is someone. So I want you to feel like that.
Berry Gordy Jr. made sure that Motown's artists had elements of etiquette commonly practiced by white America. By integrating formalities into their mannerisms, artists created a cultural compromise that would alter the less than dignified image commonly held of black musicians in that era. The third compromise made was by the producers. Berry Gordy Jr. ultimately desired crossover in the record industry. Therefore, he knew that he had to hire some white salesmen and producers to get the job done. One of Motown's most distinguished producers was Barney Ellis. After agreeing to work with Motown in 1960, he received racist backlash from the white community.
His immigrant father was definitely wondering what on earth his son was doing. Barney would often come in contact with whites who would question, why he was working for them.
Tom Noonan, another white executive, recalls, "When friends would see me, people would often ask what it was like to work for a black company, and I would say, the money is green." And the money was green indeed. Motown's records were hitting the top of the charts, from My Girl by the Temptations to Stop in the Name of Love by the Supremes to Dancing in the Street by Martha and the Vandellas. White producers of Motown made a cultural compromise by defying societal expectations and working for a black company. Motown was quickly becoming an example of black economic empowerment. In the midst of the company's growth, Detroit and America were still ridden with political conflict. In response to this, Berry Gordy Jr. insisted that the company should largely remain apolitical. Although Gordy Jr. was close friends with Martin Luther King, he understood that there were limits as to how he could express himself politically and still represent a record label appealing to the masses. Motown made donations to the SCLC and recognized the importance of the civil rights movement, but did not publish songs that explicitly pushed out any messages for or against it. In turn, Dr. King understood Gordy Jr.'s goals, thanked him for his contributions, and supported him as a prosperous black entrepreneur. In an era of American musical history during which nearly all popular music was anti-establishment themed, Motown was distinct in that it was lighthearted, upbeat, and fun.
I don't want to make it sound like it was just about him going out making money, but this record label was doing amazing things for black artists. And if you don't sell records, those amazing things don't happen.
If you were going to be political at that time, in the music business, there were going to be limits to what you could do.
Berry Gordy Jr. stuck true to what he had learned from the Gordy dinner table meals growing up. Commerce, education, discipline, and ultimately economic success were the most important things that African Americans in his time should be concerned about. In the short term, Motown's success economically assisted hundreds of African Americans, not only by directly providing jobs within the company, but also by allowing competitors in the music industry to become aware of the potential black artists held. After Motown, radio stations began to play more and more black music. In 1972, CBS Records commissioned the Harvard University Business School to analyze whether black music was profitable. After affirmative results, the company invested in, distributed, and supported music by black artists. Soon after, other record companies such as Warner's and Capitol followed. In the long term, Motown's success bettered the image of African Americans in the United States. While it may seem like the civil rights movement and Motown's journey were disconnected from each other, they influenced one another in a number of ways. The ability to run an independent business, the image of appearing well-mannered and sharp, and the crossover of cultures deteriorated negative racial stereotypes that, in the past, charged racial conflict and tension. Motown represented a black, non-radical, successful company, which not only opened doors for African Americans, but also caused white Americans to rethink and reevaluate their perception of race. By making a series of cultural compromises, the songwriters, artists, and producers of Motown were able to build a company that had enormous impact on political conflict while circumventing direct involvement. In the end, the success of Motown improved race relations in unexpected and unconventional ways, changing the image of African Americans in the United States forever.
Motown made what mattered to me, the music, nothing else.